So welcome everybody once again to the How to Build a Sustainable Supply Chain webinar. I am here today with Veronica Pasirico. I myself am Victoria Vero. I'm ESG team lead at Nexio Projects. We have two teams within Nexio Project. One is the ESG team. I'm going to explain in a second what we work on. And our other team is the climate change team. And yeah, I'm leading the ESG team with a bit of a background in organizational development, change management, and the sustainable, sustainability basically from various angles, non-profits, social sustainability, and now a little bit of general sustainability overview as well. Course. And Veronica, do you want to very briefly introduce yourself too?
Thank you so much. So hello everyone, I'm Veronica Pasirico. I'm an ESG facilitator at Nexio Projects, which means that I'm a project manager. I know that sometimes the facilitator title is confusing. So I've been with the company for a couple of years, focusing on eco-wise projects and general sustainability strategy projects.
Thank you. And as promised, a little bit about what we do. So as I mentioned, we have two sides of the organization, the ESG and the climate change. On the ESG side, we work quite a lot with sustainability strategy development. That includes things like materiality assessment, supplier engagement, ESG gap analysis, etc. We also work a lot with ratings and certifications. That's what Veronica just referred to, work with EcoVadis is one of their biggest global partners on their assessments, B Corp, UNGC, as well as ISO standards. And on ESG reporting as well, supporting our clients with writing up sustainability reports, but also working with the GRI standards and other integrated non-financial reporting and disclosures. And then our climate change team is working with anything from organizational carbon footprinting to science-based targets, CDP, LCAs, and the likes. And what we are going to talk about today is a little bit of setting the scene. So just to be on the same page about sustainable procurement. I think most of you understand quite a lot of the topic already and the urgency, but we are going to look a little bit into the details with Veronica. And then we are going to break down the key challenges of sustainable procurement. And we have prepared with quite a lot of case examples from our work with our clients. To show how different organizations have addressed those challenges and how this has come across in the various projects we have worked on so far. Now we are going to talk about some of the highlighted best practices just to sum it all up. And as I promised, we're going to finish off with a Q&A. And again, if there is any question, feel free to please put it into the Q&A box and we are going to get back to them at the end. And Veronica, the floor is yours.
Of course, thank you so much. So indeed, first of all, we wanted to set the scene a little bit and also get you all excited about the topic of today. So of course, we're all here to talk about sustainability. Sustainability is becoming kind of like a buzzword, as also seen by Google Trends. It's really picking up in the last few years. And you know that companies are really focusing on their attention on sustainability and see what that can bring to their company in terms of value and also of relationships with third parties, etc., etc. But there is something that is not really being tackled so far, and that is the supply chain of each company and the sustainability related to your suppliers. So even from this graph, you see that the environmental impact for most industries really come from supply chain. Actually, for especially the manufacturing industry, the scope 3 emissions, so the emissions from the supply chain account for around 90% of the total emission. So you see how that really brings in a lot of potential value for the company and something to really focus on in order to push the sustainability agenda forward and reach all the sustainability goals. So just to talk a little bit more about what we're discussing today, of course, it's going to be on supply chain and sustainable procurement. I'm trying to get closer to the mic so then hopefully you hear me better. Let me know if that works. Otherwise, we can fix it really quickly. But then what do we mean when we talk about sustainable procurement? So for a company, we need to make sure that the products, but also the services that are purchased are as sustainable as possible, meaning that they have a low environmental impact, also the emissions that we were discussing before, but also they bring positive social results. And of course, the social part of your supply chain is really important. I think we all remember the cases and the scandals that hit some companies in the past few years, especially in the fashion industry, and all the scandals around how suppliers were treating their all good. Perfect. I got a thumbs up from our marketing team, so that's great. And all kind of like the impact that had on the brand image and all and on the companies themselves. So that's kind of like what we want to focus on today. Of course, this focus on sustainability comes from the clients, comes from, of course, us, since we're helping companies with it, and it comes internally from companies, but we also see that a lot has changed in terms of legislation. And the biggest change has happened, of course, in the EU. Some countries already have some sort of regulations / directive when it comes to the supply chain. So for example, the French corporate duty of vigilance, but also the German Supply Chain Act. And now things will change for all European countries with the European Due Diligence Directive. Just to give you an update on how that one is going, it was presented in February. Now it's still in discussion. I think now it's with the parliament, and then they expect the directive to be finalized in March next year. So it is coming up, and that will be a big change for companies when they will really need to look into their supply chain a bit more into details and really see what is going on from an environmental and a social perspective. But maybe I scared you with all these laws and regulations on sustainable procurement. But of course, what we want to bring today is also the challenges, but also the kind of like what the sustainable procurement can mean for your company and all the benefits that it can cover, and kind of like what is untapped also in terms of really sorry, I keep saying challenges. I don't want to say challenges. I want to say benefits. Really the benefits and what your companies can gain from really putting the effort on sustainable procurement. So here we have listed some of them, and then I think as we look at the challenges, we will be able to kind of like see what is the challenge and also what is then the outcome and the benefit that can come from it. So as we were saying before, with scope 3 emission, reduce greenhouse gas emission would be the first one. It can really help with that, but also reduce the environmental impact of your operations. If you think, for example, of the materials that you're using. And as we were mentioning before, the social part of it, so really the human rights support, making sure that you know what's happening in your suppliers, factories and companies, making sure that everyone is treated in the right way, etc. And also increase the supplier diversity. I think this is kind of like the last thing around sustainable procurement. It is the diversity of suppliers. That is something that started in the US and now it's really picking up also in Europe. So that is something to be able to tackle that, to be able to have really a different suppliers coming from different diversity and minority-owned business and women-owned business. I think that's a really nice opportunity for company. And then lastly, an improved brand reputation. We saw what the effect of bad supply chain can be on a company, but then there are also a lot of benefits in collaborating with your suppliers and really make sure that you have that communication and that relationship. But more on that as we go through the challenges. So as for the challenges, Victoria, I think it's your turn again.
Yeah, thank you so much for passing on and explaining all of that. I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the top 6 challenges that that we have seen, and then we are going to deep dive into each of those one by one. So when we talk about the top 6, The first one is the lack of knowledge around sustainable practices in supply chain. This lack of knowledge can be both on the side of the organization who is looking at their supply chain, as well as within the supply chain itself. The second is prioritization of topics to address. We call these risks, but both directions, so prioritization of what to even address. The third one is managing relationships, engaging those suppliers, basically. The fourth is the governance structure, how to create governance around sustainable supply chains and sustainable procurement overall. Then the fifth one is the lack of resources that organizations face while implementing sustainable procurement. And the last one, the sixth one, is the lack of engagement, again, from the supplier side. So the managing the relationships and lack of engagement go a little bit hand in hand, of course. But one is a little bit more about the relationship structures and how do you go about it, and the other is really the how do you motivate, how do you create a positive willingness to contribute. So before we deep dive, I would be very curious to hear, and we have a little poll to share with you. Which actions have you already taken for sustainable procurement? And there we go with the poll. So the options are to, for everybody to know, training on the topic, supplier assessment, KPI measurements, or something else. If it's something else, then we would love to hear that in the chat.
Victoria, which one do you think will be the first one?
Good question. I actually think most organizations tend to start with the supplier assessment. So my vote would be on that one. What do you think?
I think indeed it's either supplier assessment, or then I think training on the topic would be second. But it's true that sometimes if you have an assessment, then you go for the KPI measurements. So it's tricky. I don't know. I'm really curious about the results now.
Yeah, I'm very, very curious as well. Do we have a result yet? Oh, there we go. So we do, and not bad, not bad. Supplier assessment actually did win by 64%, and training on the topic is second one on 51%. And I'm going to be very curious to hear some of the other points as well when we look at the chat. Let me see. I think some of the people said, Tom, guidance with large circular trends. Somebody else, Amy Glaive, wrote that we have just written a formal sustainable procurement policy.
Congrats on that one.
Very nice. Catherine says supplier code of conduct, due diligence, guidelines, policy, and responsible business. Andy writes capacity building, enhancing transparency in the supply chain. Very nice ones. Karine says formalized process defining critical suppliers and what the criteria are. So beautiful, very nice inputs. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And yeah, we are going to actually address some of those points moving forward. As I mentioned, if my computer cooperates, the first challenge that we've listed is the lack of knowledge regarding sustainability practices. Interestingly enough, you probably remember we asked this question also in the sign-up sheet for this webinar. And actually, the lack of knowledge came back as the top one, not by far, but basically as the top challenge that you all are facing as well from the responses. As I mentioned, what this means is basically lack of knowledge around how to implement sustainability, how to implement sustainable procurement, both within your own organizations, but also amongst your suppliers. Some of the things that you can do to go about this challenge is to indeed implement training. So start actually raising awareness across the organization. I've just about a week ago had a very interesting conversation with a bunch of organizations in another avenue about sustainability training and implementing sustainability training, looking at the different levels that you can address sustainability training within the organization, starting with sort of basic, almost compliance level sustainability training to everyone, but also moving forward, how do you address training for your functional departments on sustainability, for your sustainability team that coordinates sustainability effort, as well as for management level, and especially also for your board. So looking at implementing sustainability training is definitely one way to start increasing the knowledge. And obviously, when you're looking at sustainable procurement, you want to address that with your you want to address that with your procurement team first. I already made your procurement team your sustainable procurement team right away. There we go. The other challenge that typically arises is around understanding where you are within that knowledge. So understanding the data, understanding how to collect data, what kind of data exists, and what does that tell about your organization. So some of the ways you can address that is improving the way you actually collect data and audit data, especially from your suppliers, and also measuring KPIs related to sustainable procurement to really understand how you are performing and which actions are making the biggest impact in your organization. We actually not long ago ran into this challenge with one of our clients, by the way. It was a very interesting case because the moment we started working with this organization, they themselves had very little knowledge on sustainability. And also their suppliers haven't gotten very far. So most of the top suppliers that they work with have not really implemented many sustainability related measures. So the way we actually started addressing this together is very first step was to have a sustainability gap analysis, which established our shared understanding between us as well as the client, where they were in terms of sustainability, also where they wanted to go, what their goals and ambitions were, and what were the gaps in between. And from here onwards, we designed and delivered a basic sustainability awareness training for the whole organization to get them again to the same level. Everybody in the organization have the same basis understanding of what sustainability related topics are important for the organization and what those mean. And then afterwards, we actually started to introduce data collection on some of the key critical areas. For example, for them, it was waste management. Moving onwards, we actually also started having discussions with some of their suppliers to understand, and these were open conversations, to understand how their suppliers look at sustainability, what's important for them, what pressures they are facing, etc. And then based on this, we actually implemented a supplier questionnaire, which is very similar to what we have been talking about in terms of supplier assessment. And then from the questionnaire, we are going to be able to create an engagement strategy moving forward. We haven't gotten to the engagement strategy just yet. That's going to be the next step. But it's basically all of those steps that you can also follow similarly to what we have listed here in a real case as well, on how to actually raise the awareness of sustainability, both within your organization as well as with your suppliers. The next challenge is prioritizing supply chain sustainability risk. Basically, what this is about is that every organization will need to actually select priority topic areas that they want to work on with their suppliers. Sustainability, we always say, is a pretty big area. Of course, it covers so many topics, and you need to learn how to focus within that. So that's when you start, when you want to start looking at risks. For this, conducting a materiality assessment is a pretty useful tool. Materiality basically helps you understand what are the most important areas that might impact your organization, or your organization might impact in terms of sustainability. And engaging your stakeholders is extremely important in this process, to have their view on that as well, because if you only run this assessment internally, then you might get a bit of a tunnel view instead of having everybody's perspective with whom you are engaging. So that those stakeholders, of course, can include your customers, it can include your community, but very importantly, it also needs to include your suppliers. In the Global Reporting Initiative, there are pretty good guidelines. So if you don't know how to conduct a materiality assessment, I highly recommend to check that out. And we also, by the way, on our website have some basic materiality guidelines. So if you visit there, you can look at the step-by-step process. But a case I quickly wanted to mention is one of our clients in the chemicals industry. They are a manufacturer of chemicals. And the way they approach it as well, together in a set of projects with us, was starting with a basic risk assessment for their suppliers. This basic risk assessment was looking at purchasing category and location of their suppliers. Then they also created a code of conduct, which they asked their suppliers to sign. And they started putting procedures in place based on the risk. So when they looked at the risk assessment and certain risks came back as more important than others, they started actually putting those procedures in place according to the risks. So one of those was, for example, to introduce an environmental management system to reduce those key risks. And then they also started to introduce due diligence procedure. And based on all of this, they started creating action plans to address all of the various other risk areas that were not covered by the procedures mentioned before. So again, the step-by-step process was basically risk assessment, code of conduct, starting to put procedures in place related to environmental management, due diligence, and then creating an action plan for all of the rest of the risks as well to address. Some of it together, of course, with your suppliers. The next one on the list is the supplier relationship management part. This is where I mentioned before that it addresses a little bit the structuring of the relationship. Again, one of the challenges I often hear from our clients is that it's overwhelming. When the topic comes up around sustainable supply chain engagement with our clients, a lot of them say, well, we have hundreds of suppliers. How do we even go about engaging them? This is really important to understand, that you don't need to engage them, all of them at the same level, and you don't actually really need to engage them too much. You don't need to engage all of them too much either. Some of it you are going to engage a lot more than others, and a lot of them are going to group into the review of performance category. So what you see in front of you here, by the way, is a really, really helpful way of looking at it. You will have suppliers that you work on just a transactional level. It's typically suppliers that you don't buy from much, it's relatively little amount, and the relationship doesn't matter very much for your overall overall supplier base, so to say. There's going to be a bunch of suppliers of whom you want to review the performance. So these are the suppliers with whom you work more regularly, middle-sized purchases. So they typically will take the majority of your suppliers, and you want to understand where they are, what their risks are, how they perform in terms of sustainability, how they perform in regards to risks, etc. Then there will be handful or so of your suppliers that you will move to a strategic alliance or even joint partnership stage. Those are the ones that you work much more closely together. With strategic alliance, you typically work on joint products or services, collaborate on projects. Joint partnership already takes it really to a full partnership with formal frameworks in place, etc. And so what you basically do is you start categorizing based on spend, based on profile, based on size, geographical area, and a whole lot of other categories or other points where each of your suppliers will go. And then you decide what is the level of engagement you want to work with them. So that's kind of, this is one way to look at it, this particular framework. You don't have to use this one, of course, but the most important is really that you categorize your suppliers and you look at specifically the ones that you spend the most on, and also the ones that are high-risk industries or high-risk geographical areas. Those are really important to address because those are the ones that pose the biggest risk on your own operations. We actually not long ago worked with a large international organization in the banking sector that did exactly just what I explained, by the way. They set up some clear criterion categories on how to engage with their suppliers based on the total spend. That was the first main category, then organizational size and industry. They didn't add geography because all of their suppliers were within the European Union. So in that sense, for them, the geography didn't matter too much. But the moment you get outside of that, then it starts becoming a lot more important. And then they created an engagement plan for each of these categories, which meant that different categories would have different levels of expectations, both regarding the performance as well as regarding the reporting. So it was very important for this organization to, not overburden, for example, small organizations that they have small spend with, still have a little bit of an engagement with them, but put much more effort into, for example, the bigger organizations or the ones that they have much bigger spend with to really understand how they are doing on sustainability. And then not just in terms of performance reporting, but they also actually use this categorization to then define which category gets what sort of engagement activities. For example, capacity building, also the bonus-malus system, which included the reward program, etc. So it was very nice to see that sort of categorization, because that allows organizations really to start focusing and not spread themselves too thin. And on to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much. So that for this part, we wanted to go a little bit deeper into the governance structure that companies have in place and how sustainable procurement plays into it. We see with a few clients that usually sustainable procurement, especially if it's in the first steps, it's really something really nice that lives by itself. But then as soon as the procurement teams get busy, it gets pushed aside a little bit. And that's where kind of like all the benefits get lost. So our suggestion, but then also based on the ISO standard for sustainable procurement, the 2600, is really to make sure that sustainable procurement is included in the sustainability management system. So then it follows kind of like the same path as you might have, for example, for your ISO 14001. So starting with the management being involved and really make sure that the relevancy of sustainable procurement is understood by the management. Start with the policy, really have a vision for your sustainable procurement. What are you trying to achieve in the future? How should that look like? Then work on a strategy and really making sure that you have set targets for the future and a clear vision on how you're going to achieve that. Work with the procedures that you have in place, so all the actions that will help you reaching the targets that you have set for yourself, and then also feeding back into the reporting. I know that we already had some questions on what to track, and then we're going to be happy to answer them later, but the reporting is really the part that allows you to make sure that you're on track with the targets that you have set for yourself. And then you can really see what are the results, what are the benefits, who are the suppliers involved, et cetera, et cetera. And that will lead you back to the policy, to the strategy that you have set for yourself, checking whether those targets are still up to date, if they need to be reviewed, if the procedures are working, et cetera, et cetera. So that say that this is kind of like the best approach to sustainable procurement. So really making sure that it follows the same path as other sustainability management system, and that everything is in place for sustainable procurement to be a part of your procurement. So really that the small steps of sustainable procurement are integrated into the ones that you have already. So then it's not something on the side, but it's really just the same as everything else. I know someone was asking about what to do when procurement manager are really focused on just the spend and the cost. It's also by having this kind of system in place. So then the sustainability part of procurement, it's not an add-on, but it's really part of what you do in your sustainability strategy in general. And then for the next one, it's actually something that I have really at heart because it's one of the topics that our clients bring up the most, and it's we don't have enough resources. Of course, when it comes to sustainability and sustainable procurement, there is a need for resources, both in terms of the money spent, but also on the people who are available to work on this. And a lot of our clients come and say, well, our procurement team already had a rough year. I don't know if we can ask them for more. And we know that that is the case. But then I think also, as Victoria was saying before, kind of like taking one step at a time and really building on your sustainable procurement. That's first and foremost what we really want to share and suggest. It's really important to understand that it's a long-term process. So of course, there's a lot that you can do and a lot that you want to do right away. But then it's really important to really start from the basis and see, okay, what can we do now with the resources that we have? What makes sense for us to start with? Because we see that sometimes companies want to push it forward, and that's great, but then they have too many measures in place and too many targets, and then they get lost with everything else. So really making sure that you start really from what is needed, and then you build on it also as the team gets more knowledge on the topic, and then it's more at ease also with that conversation with supplier. The second one is, of course, don't start from scratch. You probably already have a good measures in place and a good sustainability system that you can really build on, and then making sure that sustainable procurement is added into that. The third one is break internal silos. We know that sometimes teams, are quite divided, but especially when it comes to procurement, it touches on a lot of things in the company. So it's really important to have an open conversation, have teams collaborate as needed, really make sure that that type of responsibility is also divided between different people in the company, the ones that are really relevant for what you're working on. The first one is to use dedicated tools, especially if you see that you're trying to reach quite a high sustainable procurement standard, but the resources internally in terms of people, in terms of time are really limited. There are a lot of good sustainable procurement tools or procurement tools in general that can really help you in making sure that you keep an eye on all the suppliers, that you're getting all the replies for your sustainability questionnaire or the audits. For example, one of them is EcoVadis, which has a special part where it's on the supply chain, and you can request your suppliers to go through an EcoVadis assessment. So then they will need to fill in the assessment and they will get the support of EcoVadis if needed. And then you can use the results to really see, okay, what are they working on that's great, what is not going well, who do I need to maybe keep a closer eye on, with who I should have a conversation, and how should I help them to get better in their sustainability from all different aspects. And then the final one is, of course, the consultative support. Well, Nexio is, of course, one of them, but I think especially if you see that there's maybe a lack of knowledge internally, you will need some support in identifying what exactly do we need to work on, where should we start, how do we train our people. Then it's always great to be able to outsource that as needed and really bring in the professional support that you will need on certain topics or on a lot of topics if you really feel the need to. But always know that there are a lot of resources outside that you can really use to make sure that the sustainable procurement in your company is a success. And then I think for the final challenge is, of course, a really, really important one, which is the lack of supplier engagement. A lot of the companies we work with, they say, this sounds great, but our suppliers are not interested in this. If we send something to sign or a questionnaire, they will not get back to us, they're not interested. And we know that that happens. So that's why it's really important to have that supplier engagement and that collaboration with supplier. So also going back to the example that Victoria was explaining at the beginning, the company which we were working with that was not really familiar with sustainability with, the first thing was indeed to educate, inform both internally but also externally, making sure that your suppliers really understand the sustainability challenges that you're facing, that they're facing, and how to overcome them and turn them into opportunities for both of you. That will be the first step. And then it will come to setting the expectations. Of course, you have your targets for your sustainability procurement, you know where you want to reach, but then it's important to communicate that suppliers and really let them know these are the things that we would like you to work on, that we want to collaborate together, and we would like you to reach in this certain timeline. The next one, of course, is once you have set your expectations, you have communicated your target, is being able to monitor how they're doing, conduct that on-site audits if you have them, send the questionnaire, and really monitor how they're doing with their sustainability, how far they're going, whether they are improving, and if there's any problem, then be able to act upon it. The fourth level, which is kind of like the next step, and this is also where it becomes really, really interesting and fun, is the remediation, but also supplier building capacity. So when you see that there's maybe either a lack of sustainability actions from your suppliers, but also maybe there are some opportunities that are not there yet. So there is something that you will need, maybe you need a certain materials, but your suppliers don't have it yet, that you really engage in that conversation with them, saying, okay, we love to work with you. Do you think you will be able to do this certain material for us or this certain service? And that's really where you bring your engagement and the relationship to the next level. So you help them if they're struggling, but you also kind of push them to be a little bit better and also be a better supplier for you and really build on that long-term relationship. And then the final level is the partnership and also the engagement with sub-tier suppliers. I think also with partnership, you might know that there are a lot of interesting partnership. So for example, EcoVadis has some sector initiatives where companies in the same sectors, big players come in and they bring their suppliers to make sure that there is this knowledge sharing, that communication, that knowledge building. And that really helps in then building more opportunities for everyone and also pushing the industry to the next level when it comes to sustainability. And also the engagement with sub-tier suppliers. So of course, you know, for a lot of companies, actually, the number of sub-tier suppliers is quite extensive. And that's kind of like where you get lost and you're not really sure what is happening because, of course, it's harder to get that information. But if you have a good procurement system to start with, then you also have the capacity to look into the sub-tier suppliers and look into what they're doing from sustainability perspective and see if there you can help or you can help them out or really kind of like build again this long-term relationship. So I think that was all for the challenges. I think Victoria is back to you with the best practices.
Thank you. In the meantime, I was looking at the questions and very interestingly, we did get one indeed on the not just one, several ones on the sub-tier suppliers. So we will get back to this question towards the end of this. in a few minutes. But before that, I wanted to share a couple of best practices, which we already talked about, but to make sure that you have a nice summary of the things that we've mentioned so far. So the first one is to assess your suppliers, understand your current position and your goals. I say assess your suppliers, but you might want to actually start with assessing yourself to understand where your own organization is. But definitely when we talk about sustainable procurement, do continue with assessing your suppliers as well. This really helps you see where everything is at. It doesn't need to be yet a criteria. You don't need to assess your suppliers to a degree like, oh, if you don't hit this level, then I'm not going to work with you. That will come later, probably, but do start at least with understanding where your suppliers are at. Ask that information from them. The second thing that we recommend is to map out your suppliers. We mentioned about the risk assessments earlier. Map out where your suppliers come from, which are the top suppliers by spend, which are the high risk areas in terms of topics based on your materiality assessment, but also which are your high risk suppliers in terms of geography, in terms of industry. Some industries are, of course, bigger polluters than others. Those are going to be potentially a high-risk industry, or industries where, for example, child labor, human rights issues can be prevalent, etc. You really want to understand where your suppliers are on that mapping, and then pick out the ones that you need to start focusing on first. Then the third best practice is to start developing policies and initiatives based on the assessment and the mapping. As I mentioned with the first example as well that we walked through with this client, we first indeed went through the whole process of understanding, and now the development is going to be the next step. So in the policies, you start writing down what your objectives are, what the measures are that you want to take towards those objectives. What are the initiatives that you start taking? Start taking those steps. And as I mentioned before, number 4, prioritize those actions based on the high risk areas that have come out of your materiality assessment, that have come out of your risk assessment. So really make sure that you address the high priority areas. This can be in very basic terms. If you have, for example, a company that you're working with that has, I don't know, a conflict mineral risk, then you're going to start assessing that with traceability, with transparency, with where do the minerals come from, how are they mined, maybe even actually saying, all right, we don't want to work with conflict minerals at all, get that out of the picture. So you start looking at, all right, what are those priority areas, and then align that with your policies and initiatives. The number 5 is going to be to engage your suppliers. And this is actually going to answer a whole lot of your questions that I have seen as well, about traders, about data, about the challenges. What I often see is organizations being kind of stuck at their own doorstep and not necessarily starting the collaboration with their suppliers, or even before a collaboration, even start a conversation with their suppliers. You need to actually learn to work together. You need to start really engaging them, explain them what you want to do, how you want to do, what's important for you, because that way you can get them on board. And I've really witnessed this with so many of our own clients as well. The moment they started talking to their suppliers, a lot of things that didn't seem to be possible actually all of a sudden became possible, just because that conversation got started. So that engagement, and obviously you don't need to have that conversation with everyone, but have that conversation with the most important ones at least, or the most risky ones to start working together. And then finally, the last and sixth best practice is to select, basically build a preferred supplier program. This is where I said at the beginning, at the assess part, that that's not where you select yet. That's where you understand and start collecting data. But then eventually you want to create baselines. What is the minimum I'm expecting of a supplier, and what do I want the supplier really to have, and make them a preferred supplier. Build a preferred supplier program where you basically reward your suppliers for doing the right thing. So those would be the key best practices. And I would be very curious to hear which best practice would you prioritize within your organization. And the poll is open. The choices are mapping suppliers, assessing suppliers, developing policies and initiatives, engaging with suppliers, selecting preferred suppliers, or prioritizing high-risk areas, just based on what I've just mentioned. What do you think, Veronica, is going to be coming out and top?
I was thinking about it. I was wondering if assessing suppliers will then win again. I know that this is something that companies are really interested in. But I know that also developing policies and initiative, it's a good first step. So I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah.
The more I read them, the more I'm like, oh, but also mapping suppliers, that could be.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of gave almost like a step-by-step process in the previous slide, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the priority order, of course, for the participants as well. Do we have some
whether they understood everything? It's actually a tricky question.
Do we have some results yet? Oh, very interesting. Okay, so prioritizing high-risk areas came back as first. Then shortly followed, that's at 25%, shortly followed by mapping suppliers at 23%, assessing suppliers at 20%, and engaging with suppliers at 18%. So those kind of following each other quite closely. And developing policies and initiatives, as well as selecting preferred suppliers, didn't get a whole lot of votes. Only 9% and 5% of all votes. So that's thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And then just very quickly, finally, the key takeaways. Again, just going through kind of the key highlights that we have mentioned before. Get to know your supply chain, focus on high impact areas, embed sustainable procurement in your strategy, invest in supplier relationships, and finally, engage and grow together with your suppliers. We have described all of this in a great level of detail, and I'm burning to answer some of your questions. So let's switch to the Q&A. All right, I'm going to start from the beginning. Somebody is asking, how do you address the fact that procurement managers are concerned about cost more than anything else? How do you present a business case? Veronica, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I do actually. I was thinking about it because that's also what we were mentioning before. And I think, especially when we were discussing kind of like the long-term relationship that you have with them, I think that's a really strong business case, because especially now where the supply chain is having issues, kind of like have that, if you can count on that strong relationship, on that trust, the mutual trust, then they might be your preferred suppliers, but you also might be their preferred client. You know what I mean? That they do tend to have that relationship that they can build on. So I think that's just really something to think about. And then also, as we have discussed before, when it comes to sustainability, it is true that sometimes not always the most sustainable product comes with a higher price. Then also it is to be taken into account, what is the price of a product that costs less? What is the price, for example, for on a social perspective, what could be the impact if something goes wrong in the supply chain and then the company brand is involved? What is the cost of that product in terms of their environmental impact? So I think there are a lot of different costs to be taken into account, and that should be part of the presentation of the discussion. I don't know what you think, Victoria, on this one.
Absolutely agree. And in the current supply chain issues that the world is facing, the reliability and having that close relationship actually can come very handy. But also when we look at sustainable procurement processes, there is quite some research more and more actually proving that it gets cheaper because sustainable procurement is actually more efficient than non-sustainable procurement. Also because obviously you're working a lot closer with your suppliers, you're looking at a lot closer in, for example, transport routes, in fuel efficiency, as well as all other related things. So it actually, funny enough, it tends to be cheaper on the long run, with sometimes a little bit of initial hurdles with terms of costs, in terms of struggles as well, but eventually it gets it comes back. All right, next one. What measures should procurement track? And I think that was a related question as well later on. Collect what data from suppliers? Yes, exactly. So that was a couple of questions on basically what data do we need to collect from suppliers?
Do you want to tackle that one, or do you want?
So in principle, it's really up to your organization and what are the areas that you need an eye on. That might be a very generic answer, but typically you want to actually start looking at, all right, what are the areas I'm looking at? So when we looked at those risk mapping, risk assessment, and also the materiality assessment, you look at, all right, these are the topics that are important for my organization, for my business, for my industry. So these are also the topics that I need to track and measure from my suppliers. It really depends on industry. Some of the typical information that you want to look at is, for example, their energy efficiency, their greenhouse gas emission, whether they even track it or not, how, what is their footprint. Very often you want to look at what are the practices they do. Do they have policies in place? Do they have reporting in place, tracking, do they have, for example, measures in place or certificates or whatever to ensure there is no human rights breaches. But, so you want to look at all of the different areas within sustainability pillar by pillar. So environment, social, governance, if we go with the ESG pillars in particular, but within those pillars, what exactly you are looking at is always going to be dependent on your needs, your company, and your industry overall. I know that's probably not the answer you were hoping for, but unfortunately, that is the reality.
It really is. And then also on top of that, the monitoring, what we were discussing before. So if you have some sort of audits and assessment on your supply, it's really important to make sure that you have a way of monitoring that and monitor that KPI. So let's say you do a risk assessment, so you have all that data, really making sure that you track that you track the improvement. If you have a supplier code of conduct, tracking who has signed it. If you're doing training either internally or with your suppliers, tracking the attendance and kind of like the outcome of that. So also making sure that you get the right information from suppliers, but that also you keep track of the right information to make sure that they're on track with everything that you want them to achieve. So again, quite vague, but then hopefully that will be sufficient. And actually, I think, Victoria, we got a few questions on how far down the line of supply chain should we go? Tier 1, tier 2.
Yeah. Tier many, exactly. I was going to address exactly those questions because we have quite a lot. So it's a very, very interesting topic. So when you get started, you definitely want to get started with your tier 1, with your direct suppliers. because that's kind of easiest and most straightforward, of course, to handle. How far down the line you go is a little bit dependent on, of course, the type of your business and how far you are able to get any control over that supply chain. In some type of industries is obviously better than others. Now, again, in some industries, so for example, when we look at you are a supermarket and you are purchasing obviously the supplies in for the supermarket from wholesalers, and they get it from somewhere else, and they get it from somewhere else, and then that has ingredients that come from somewhere else. Obviously, that is a very, very, very long line. What you probably want to do is to look at the practices and the data from your tier 1, maybe some of the key tier 2s with collaboration with those key tier 1 suppliers. So for example, if you have a major wholesaler that works with some other places where they purchase, then you want to work with that wholesaler and identify, all right, what are the key tier 2 organizations that you together should be looking at, and then what are the best ways to engage them. But down the line, if you need to go that deep, it's rarely, I wouldn't say it's rarely necessary, but it's very, very, very complicated. So, one of the things that you can do is look at traceability tools, for example, because those ones will allow you to get a good idea of where your where the products or ingredients or materials whatsoever come from, and what is the process that they have gone through. But in short, when you're looking at, for example, emission data, essentially you are looking at tier 1 and some tier 2 at maximum if you identify that there are some key tier 2 suppliers that really complete your picture ultimately. And then of course engage your own suppliers to engage with their suppliers, because that will complete the data as well. But again, that comes back down to the collaboration of the whole story.
Nice. I saw that someone was asking how to go about sustainable procurement for small and medium-sized businesses, and we know that that is an interesting question. So based on our experience, also with the clients that we were mentioning before, the first step is to make sure that your team has the right knowledge on sustainability and sustainability procurement. And then, as we were saying before, we mentioned a lot like the preferred suppliers, the mapping of suppliers. I think especially when we're talking about small or medium business, of course, the capacity of checking all of your suppliers and have that type of engagement requires for a lot of time. So what we suggest is to really start with mapping out your suppliers. What are your main suppliers when it comes, for example, of how money you spend each year on them, and then make sure that those are the ones that you engage with the most. So I would suggest starting, of course, with a policy. So then, of course, you have those, like you have that vision for your sustainability procurement, but then the targets that you set maybe are set just for your top suppliers first, and then you really try to engage in that conversation, in that capacity building and collaboration. And also something that I want to mention, because I know that that is always kind of like hard to grasp for smaller businesses, that sometimes you feel you don't have the power with your suppliers. So you're like, oh, I cannot ask them for filling in my questionnaire because they will not do it. They will not give me the information on sustainability. I think how you can also frame it is that probably your suppliers are required to work on their sustainability by other companies as well. So then if you help them in kind of like building that sustainability and you help them in with a collaboration, then it's really interesting to build something together instead of just asking for the question. They might prefer to work with and building their sustainability with a smaller company than a huge player. So really tap into that collaboration opportunity that is there, and remember that your request on sustainability might not be the only one they're getting. So then you can really start doing kind of like that capacity building. We saw that was really kind of like what changed for a lot of our smaller clients. And they're like, oh, actually, this is bringing a lot of interesting conversations and can really mean like a big change in our business and their business as well.
Thank you, Veronica. That was a very nice, extensive answer. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I would like to have a last poll with you, which is already on the screen. And just a quick check on what kind of services you are looking for in terms of sustainable procurement. I'm going to also put that on the slide quickly so you see. And while you are looking through the different options, sustainable procurement training, procurement strategy, Scope 3 measurement, Scope 3 reduction strategy, supplier engagement program, and policy and procedure development being the different options. I also want to mention that if there are some very, very interesting questions, which unfortunately we haven't got to answering. But I would love you to reach out if you want via LinkedIn or via email. I will share our email address in a moment. And we are very, very happy to answer these questions. And if you need any support, also obviously happy to help with that. But there are some really interesting questions I would love to address outside of the webinar if we can. And in the meantime, do we have any results on the poll already? I think we can probably close it. Yes. Yeah. Okay, super. So again, I wanted to thank you very, very much for your participation. On the contact details on the last line, you can see our email address, info@nexioprojects.com. So either there or via LinkedIn, feel free to share any questions that remained that we haven't been able to answer. And thank you very, very much again for participating, and thank you for all the very interesting questions. We really loved seeing the many questions that come in on this topic. And we wish you a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you so much.